All right, peace everyone. Welcome back to another BABTalk. I'm Larry, aka Geechee, y'all, and we got Asafo here. We have a guest, Dr. Jessica. We'll bring her on and have her introduce herself. We're going to talk about cooperatives among African Americans, the history of cooperatives. So, Dr. Jessica, please introduce yourself to the people who might not know you right now.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. I'm the author of Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. I'm a professor at John Jay College, part of City University of New York, in the Department of Africana Studies. I have the title Professor of Community Justice and Social Economic Development. I'm a political economist. I study cooperative economics, solidarity economics, racial wealth inequality, Black political economy, racial wealth inequality, things like that. And I've been studying the history of African American cooperatives for about 20 years now, along with cooperatives as a community development strategy and the benefits of cooperatives to communities, things like that, need for economic justice in order to achieve racial justice. Those kinds of things. I'm also a mother and a proud grandmother.
Nice. So, as we do often, we'll go back and forth with me and Asafo asking questions, and then also people in the audience who's watching on Facebook and YouTube, you can definitely get your questions in. And towards the end, we'll be able to pull your questions into the space. So, Asafo, we'll start with you, your question, and go back and forth. But the mute bug got you right now.
You got me once again. Good grief. So, Dr. Nembhard, you're the author of this book, Collective Courage. I'm holding it up to the so our audience can see it there. History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And could you tell us a little bit about the premise of the book and how you came to become interested in this in the history of cooperative economics and in the Black community?
Yes, absolutely. So I was working on ways to talk to Black communities about how they can take better control over economic development and what that would mean and look like, especially economic development that was family friendly, children friendly, human friendly, that kind of thing. And as I started to learn more about cooperative economics and community-based economic development and that kind of thing, I noticed that there were not a lot of examples of African-American cooperatives. When I went to co-op meetings or conferences, there weren't very many African-Americans at the conferences. And then when I started to talk to communities about doing cooperative economics, Black community people would tell me, oh, we don't do that, which made no sense to me. So I decided I needed to do some research. I'm a researcher. I figured I needed to do some research. I thought maybe I'd spend a year or two looking to see how African Americans interfaced with the cooperative movement and what kind of co-ops we had. I actually, for a while, thought I could do a book on what I call subaltern cooperative economic development, how African Americans, Latinx people, Native Americans all use cooperatives as a strategy to address their marginalization and oppression in society, right? But I ended up stuck in the African American experience because it turned out to be so much information, but very hidden. So it's a weird combination, right? It was very hard to find and slow dig. I really had to dig and slowly find the information. But every time I found information, I found links to 2 or 3 more co-ops or more people who were involved in co-ops or whatever. So I ended up having to I did archival work. I looked in old newspapers and magazines. I looked in the papers in libraries, Library of Congress, the Schomburg, for Black people who were involved in the co-op movement and their organizations. I read autobiographies. Anywhere I'd just get a line here or there, a statement here or there about what we did. And I was able to then put together this continuous history from 1700s, probably earlier, but the 1700s up to the present 21st century of activities of African Americans, both official, incorporated cooperatives as we know them now in the 20th and 21st century, but also mutual aid and other kinds of economic cooperation. And so then I just started putting it all together, started telling people about it, trying to make as many connections. I didn't want to just tell individual stories about co-ops, but I wanted to do the connections. That's why I also talked about economic thought, because it turned out that a lot of our leaders, especially by the 20th century, were also talking about co-ops and economic democracy as part of a liberation strategy. They weren't just talking about voting rights and political rights.
Something that you said about your research leading you to focus on Black cooperatives or Black folks in general. It reminds me of Dorothy Brown's book about tax system, and she says that if we ever report taxes by race, you'll see how detrimental it was for Black folks. Same thing with Marsha Baradaran. She started studying banks and then realized, like, oh, this thing is happening. And so this concept of everything is about race, it is true. But it leads me to a question of each of these books has something to do with capitalism, right? And so what you'll hear in every space that capitalism works and it pulls people out of poverty and all these other crazy things. But in your study of cooperatives, how does that help with poverty? How does it respond to capitalism? Like what has your research shown you about that economic system and how to survive and respond to it?
So the research that I have done looking at alternatives to capitalism and the ways that cooperatives have tried to mitigate and reduce the harms of capitalism is really my focus. So the work that I've looked at, I'm looking at where capitalism has failed, where capitalism has not helped anybody or has hurt people, right? So undermined communities, undermined workers, underpaid workers, kept people in poverty, kept people in poor housing, and then people came together, joined together to actually, in most of my cases, people joined together first just to study their situation, just to come together and say, what are we going to do about this? So not be totally victimized, but try to find their agency, right? And then through that collective agency, finding a collective economic structure that could actually bring them out of poverty better, reduce the oppressions of capitalism, and provide benefits that weren't just for individuals or families, but for a whole community or a wider community. And so my book is really about, right, the places where capitalism failed and the ways that African Americans as human beings asserted themselves to say, there's got to be another way to do this. And I often say part of the journey of my book is, you start out, a lot of the original stories about how co-ops started and who came together to form co-ops is about that survival, right? We had nothing. And so the only way to survive, to feed our children, right, to get healthy food, to keep some of our cultural practices together was to join together, to pool our resources and to handle it for ourselves. But rapidly, you see that things that started out with just survival motivation, actually people then realized the power they had when they came together, when they pooled those meager resources, right? They shared the risks and then shared the profits. They pooled resources that enabled them to leverage other resources. They create businesses. They created food where they didn't have food, jobs where they didn't have jobs, housing where they didn't have housing, credit exchanges, democratic credit exchanges when they couldn't get access to credit. And suddenly they also learned that they were creating a whole interlocking system of a better way to live and a better way to produce the economics that that we need to survive. And so it rapidly became more than just survival, but sort of a liberation strategy and a strategy of what some of us call economics of abundance rather than an economics of scarcity and extraction, right? So these are economics where we're all working together and sharing together, and we're creating an abundance so that we can all make it, not just letting a few trickle up and leave the rest of us behind.
So our audience, we had a previous BABTalk with Professor Mal Hyman of Coker University here in Hartsville, South Carolina, and he spoke with us briefly about cooperatives and the solidarity movement and the solidarity economy. So our audience is somewhat familiar with the concepts. Could you explain to our audience further what exactly is a worker cooperative and how are worker cooperatives managed and their benefits compared to the traditional way of doing business or managing businesses?
Right. So all cooperatives are values-based, member-centered enterprises. So it's a way of doing business where the people who are involved are called members instead of profit maximization, which is what capitalism does. We're talking about addressing needs and addressing needs in a way that creates profit sharing and democratic governance. So cooperatives, all cooperatives are companies where the members have one vote each, so you don't have more votes because you have more stock ownership or because you put more money in, so everybody has an equal vote. You're addressing a problem like rural electricity, right? It was a huge problem at turn of the 20th century. How do you get electricity out to rural places where there's one person for every 5 miles or one family for every 5 miles, right? A capitalist business will not electrify a rural area because it's not cost effective. They can't make a profit off of it. They have to put too much money into putting in the lines, and there's not enough people using the lines, right? So you don't electrify rural. Most of the United States was electrified through cooperatives, rural electric cooperatives, for that reason, because the capitalist companies wouldn't go in there. They couldn't make a profit. So they didn't electrify rural areas. So in the US, we actually luckily had a program, and by the time of the New Deal, that's the Tennessee Authority and all that was all about helping electrical cooperatives to operate. And so what they did was they pooled all the people in a region who needed electricity but couldn't get it to an existing company, and those people pooled their need, pooled their money, and then were able to get the wires through and get electric co-ops who weren't worried about the profits. They were worried about making sure to fill the need and to give high quality services to people. So you can look at almost any industry like that. Now, worker co-ops are where the workers themselves, the employees, actually own the company. A lot of co-ops, it's the consumers, right? The people who need it, like the electric co-ops, the people who needed the electricity pooled together to create those co-ops. For worker co-ops, you can either convert an existing company. The owner can sell to the employees and they can then reorganize the company as a co-op, or that you can start from the beginning as a co-op. And that's where you bring people together who are going to be the ones working in the organization. And again, it's the same issue. You're not trying to maximize profit so much as you're trying to address a need. You want good, high quality, well-paying jobs. You want the jobs to be doing a service or creating something that's needed in the community to address a community need. And then you want to organize democratically. So everybody who's a member gets a voice, a vote. The co-ops have what's called annual meetings. Sometimes it's once a year, sometimes it's once a quarter, sometimes it's every month. The annual meetings are where the whole membership gets to vote on policies and that kind of thing. And then most co-ops have the membership then elect a board of directors, and the board of directors runs the company. Worker co-ops can either do everybody is on the board of directors, or you elect members of the board of directors. And then some worker co-ops decide to self-manage, and that's usually when everybody's a member of the board of directors, and then you manage, you divide the management activities up into committees, and everybody either rotates or stays on the committee and does the management that way. Some worker co-ops do actually hire a manager that's beholden to the board, who's beholden to the members. But the idea, again, is members rule, right? The purpose is to make life better for the members. And we have data now of how much better working in a worker co-op is. One, having that ownership and control makes a difference. Two, most worker co-ops try to maximize jobs right? So they give living wages when they can, give benefits. Because you're an owner, you also get dividends back. So every year that the company is profitable, you get to share in the profit because you're an owner as well as a worker, right? Worker co-ops have better retirement plans, that kind of thing. And so between the job satisfaction, the self-determination, and then the focus on returns to work being so important, right? Worker co-ops tend to have more productivity, better satisfaction, and better incomes and retirement funds.
So speaking of profit, I want to talk about the other profit, the kind of profit who can tell the future. Many economists probably play the role of profit because they can kind of predict things that's happening. Do you foresee, in your research or study, see that capitalism is on its last leg? And I know earlier you said most Black folks either don't know or don't recognize that they can be in these kind of cooperative economics. But again, do you see capitalism as something that's failing? And then how can you suggest that this is what we probably need to do in a post-capitalistic society?
Right. So let me answer that in two ways. First of all, capitalism has always failed people of African descent. Capitalism, industrialization, and racism all actually started together around the African slave trade and enslavement of African peoples, so that capitalism has always been built on the backs of exploiting African peoples and of pitting exploited peoples against each other so that they don't have time, energy, or recognition of who the real enemy is. So in some ways, right, capitalism has always failed us. It continues to fail us. But if you don't, look at racialized capitalism in that way, and you're not thinking about that whole long trajectory, we can also look specifically at the 20th and 21st centuries, and we can see the ways that capitalism is failing itself, right? It's not, it doesn't have self-regulating mechanisms to save itself from excesses, right? It overexploits human beings and overexploits the natural world. We're seeing that, especially the overexploiting of the natural world part, right, with climate change and all that. It doesn't have any mechanisms for protecting the environment. It has no mechanisms for protecting human beings from itself. But it does have this really scary, uncanny ability to recreate itself, right? So there's been several times when capitalism has really pretty much failed, but it recreated itself, and because it's a political economy, it gets control of the politics. The politicians save it, right? So the New Deal, and during the Great Depression, the New Deal saved capitalism, right? Because the politicians decided that they had to save capitalism. 2007 to 9, the Great Recession, right? Again, politicians saved those banks. Those banks should have gone under. We should have created a whole new credit union system of community credit and democratically owned credit. But no, what did we do? We said the banks were too big to fail, and the government came in and saved them, right? Now we're trying to do the same thing through the pandemic, right? The capitalist model doesn't work that well in pandemics. It doesn't work well in crises, but the politicians every time figure out a new configuration to save it. I think what's different for the Black community right now is between the Great Recession and the pandemic, we're finally seeing that capitalism might not be the system that we want to save, right? And save it for what, right? I think people are seeing it's really not serving their purposes. It's not working that well, or at least more and more people are. So since 2007 and the recession, I've seen a growth in Black food co-ops, Black worker co-ops. There's been increasing interest in credit unions. There's been much more interest. People are finally saying, you know what, I don't want, it's like, why do we want to run back into the burning house or whatever, right? We need to leave that, let that house burn down, and let's rebuild. And I think people are much more willing now, and they're looking for understanding how to rebuild. They're naturally moving toward more mutual aid in the transition, right? So they're figuring out ways to help each other while we transition to a new system. And they're refusing some of those really horrible jobs that were either making them sick or not protecting them or whatever, that they were more obvious during the pandemic, right? People are really refusing to work under those conditions anymore. And so if that keeps happening, I don't know if we'll totally topple capitalism, but I do definitely see more and more people in communities saying, let's do something different. Let's go back to our humanity and find those solidarity, economic, cooperative systems that really, right, touch our humanity and really allow us to be human beings rather than, wearing us down and oppressing us. So I don't know if that really answers. That's not exactly the answer you wanted, but that's how I see it.
So let me ask you, how does you mentioned environmental sustainability as well? How does the solidarity economy respond to climate change, and how does it is it an answer to ecological collapse? Does it provide a way out, or does it provide a new way of living under a new, I guess the way I would call it, an environmental regime, if you will, under the domination of climate change? How does worker cooperatives and the solidarity economy respond to that?
Right. So it's not an automatic. Actually, I used to say it was automatically that people who were in co-ops were worried about the earth and all that. And partly why I used to say that was because co-ops are so locally based, right? You live and work in the same place. Usually, again, you've started a co-op because you're concerned about something in your community and trying to sustain your community and address a problem that already was undermining your community. And so in that sense, it's sort of a natural, right? Co-ops are a more natural way to address both human need and the world around you. Unfortunately, there were a couple of studies that found that not all co-ops are that ecologically minded. Again, I think mostly because we live in such a capitalist world, right? Either for them to compete in the capitalist world or that they didn't have all the values about the ecology. They had more values just about their own membership and making sure the co-op worked for them. So there are some co-ops that don't. But again, there's a growing, especially in the worker co-op world, there's a growing recognition, right, that a good job and economic democracy also means being ecologically careful, right? Partly ecological care is for our own health and safety, right? And partly because we also believe in sustainability and taking care of community and that kind of thing. So there's a growing movement. I work with a group called Green Worker Co-ops in the South Bronx, and that organization actually developed to do both, right? To create good worker co-ops, but that are in green industries, right? So to do both, to take care of, to start and be in doing green industries, but also to make sure those industries were worker owned and worker co-ops. And so to match that. And you're seeing that more and more too. There's a lot of the new worker co-ops that are for cleaning co-ops are doing ecological cleaning co-ops. They won't even let you use horrible toxic cleaners if you hire them, right? You have to supply, or they bring in ecological cleaning. And so they clearly see a connection. And so there is this growing recognition, right, that we need to protect ourselves and the earth, and that doing this through co-ops where we have a much more local focus, we have more direct say in how we do things, that people are choosing to keep the ecology in mind as well. But my main message is about how important it is to be deliberate about these things. So even as I said, not all co-ops think deliberately about that. But for me, that's one of the lessons I learned in studying cooperatives, is the co-ops that were more deliberate about how to sustain themselves, how to make sure to really be democratic, how to care for community and care for the environment. Those co-ops are stronger, more long-lasting, are more revered in their communities, that kind of thing. So as I guess in most things in life, the more deliberate, planful, strategic you are, right, the stronger and better And that's the same for co-ops. I've also found that the co-ops that really connect with the broader solidarity economy also tend to have more of these values about making sure the environment is stronger and protected and cleaned up.
Speaking of strategy, I think from our studies and experience, there's a lot of pseudo-economic and pseudo-economists in our elements, and they are spreading information that Black people believe about them economically. That we have these trillions of spending power and we could just circulate money around. Knowing that our economic condition is not the best, and that public policy and private and public partnerships is necessary. Even, we kind of saw capital was some of the issues in the book. Do you see public or private partnership happening in cooperatives without strings attached? Like, is it possible that you see it? And is there examples of that now or have been in the past?
So yeah, access to capital is definitely a big issue, especially because we still live in a capitalist economy, and you still have to, right, to run a business, you still have to bring in income and bring in more income than you spend, right? I mean, that's not exactly capitalism. The capitalism is that you want to bring in so much extra income that all you care about is the profit and you don't care about what happens in between, right? So definitely access to capital is an issue. It's an issue particularly for African Americans trying to do alternative economics, because we also, again, are the lowest of the low, right? We're the last hired, the first fired. We get the lowest salaries. We have the lowest amount of wealth, right? Well, most small businesses operate because people either have inherited wealth or they have access to credit card debt that they can use to start their business, right? If you look at, but so many African Americans already don't have any wealth, don't have access to capital, right? And so then how do you start these co-ops without anything? And so there, the beauty of co-ops is that you can start without anything because everybody puts in what they do have. You pool and buy in bulk or do it in bulk, and then you leverage what you've been able to pool together of your own to either get grants or whatever. And so it's a beautiful model in that sense that you don't have to have capital, but somewhere along the lines, capital has to come in. Some of the things I've argued for is municipalities, states, and the federal government should really be making capital available to co-ops. They should recognize how important co-op development is to human development and to alleviating poverty. Some cities, there's about at least 10 to 12 cities in the US that have some level of giving some tax money back to do co-op development. So like New York City has some programs, Madison, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Ohio. There's a bunch of other ones that I'm not going to remember. And they all do it in different ways, but they essentially are giving public money back into the co-op movement, usually to do co-op education and loan funds. So that is an important model. There are sometimes some strings attached, like you have to have a certain amount of growth in the co-op, a certain number of co-ops created. Co-ops have to get big, that kind of thing. So in that sense, there are some issues because it takes much longer for co-ops to really get established than these policies are acknowledging. But still, it is relatively money with relatively few strings when you look at it municipally like that. We're trying to get more state and federal policies that would also do education and money and stuff. But there are also some other kinds of options. There's a group called the Working World, and they now have a group of loan funds called Seed Commons, which does non-extractive lending, especially to low-income and people of color who want to do co-op development. And what they do is they actually get philanthropy and donations without strings to donate to the Seed Commons network. And then that network helps people who want to develop co-ops to develop the strongest, best co-ops they can. They give loans, and you only pay back the loan if you're successful. So they don't want to undermine the business by making you pay back the loan too soon, or if you haven't been able to make enough surplus to pay back the loan. But they also give you enough technical assistance and support so that you should be successful. And then if you pay back the loan, the interest rate is very low or nil. You have a few fees to pay. When you pay it back, they can lend it out again to help another group. So there's a growing movement of this non-extractive lending. The other model that I saw that's interesting, but I haven't seen it lately, was in the 30s, a Black group in North Carolina was able to connect with the state Department of Labor. They started first a regional co-op, Black co-op organization, and then a statewide Black co-op organization, and they started to do their own stuff. They wanted to create manuals and give workshops for how Blacks could start credit unions and co-ops. And as they started to do it, they petitioned the state agriculture department to help them do it. And so they actually got money from the state agriculture department to finish their manuals, to disseminate them, and to pay for them to go out and give workshops. And that was extremely successful. They went from, in a 12-year period, they went from like 3 Black credit unions in the state to 98 Black credit unions. About 48 other co-ops were created in that period of time. And so that kind of a partnership. So what I was going to say is the strings are less attached if the self-determination is there, right? If you're already kind of creating what it is, and then you're just saying to the state, we deserve, you owe us, we deserve for you to support us, right? As opposed to waiting for the state to create something and then you trying to tag onto it or whatever, right? So that proactivity, right? Create it first, figure out how it's going to work, what you want, what are your goals, and then, right, demand or ask for the money to do it where you're still in control of it. And I think that's what makes a difference. And so that's, again, that collective self-help attitude that's behind co-ops, right? Doing it, setting it all up, making sure you've done it on your own terms. And then when you get either coalitions or get money from other places or get public money for philanthropy, it's on your terms because you've already built it and set it up in that way.
So, just really quickly to our audience, we Dr. Nembhard was also with us during our last study session on her book. She joined us and answered questions, and we had a very, very good discussion. One of the topics that we wanted to cover but kind of ran out of time before we could cover it at length was the role of Black women in the cooperative movement. And I definitely wanted to cover that topic in this discussion. So Dr. Nembhard, if you could educate us and educate our audience regarding the role and contributions of Black women to the cooperative movement.
Right. So it was one of the surprising findings for me, and I know it shouldn't have been surprising, but it was because I had started out trying to understand co-ops in general and co-ops as a community development strategy in general before I honed in on Black communities. And in the co-op world itself, internationally, there was a lot of concern that women didn't have strong enough roles in co-ops, that they tended to be members, but they weren't the leaders, they weren't on the boards, they weren't always the founders. And so I started out trying to understand sort of why women were subordinate in a model that was supposed to be so democratic and so human, right? But when I started to look at it for African American co-ops, especially through history, I found that that wasn't necessarily the case. In a lot of cases, the Black women were the ones who started it, or they were credited with being the backbone of the co-op, keeping it sort of a lot more like their role both in the Black church and in the civil rights movement, where people actually recognized that they were the backbone, even though they didn't always get the glory and the leadership. And so the more I looked into it, the more I found that Black women's role was very strong from early on. In fact, I talk about mutual aid societies being the precursors to co-ops in the U.S. And when you look back, you see how strong the role of Black women were in mutual aid societies. They often were the ones who started them. They often were the bankers, the people who held the money. They were often the leaders, as well as the ones doing all the scud work and all that kind of thing. And then when I looked, I also found that there were a lot of Black women leaders who started out in the mutual aid societies as leaders and then moved into the co-op movement as leaders. And so there's even a continuous, right, history of being involved in this kind of economic level of decision making and leadership that people didn't recognize. And then I was able to even find more fascinating stuff like Ella Jo Baker, who everybody knows from the 50s and 60s, right, in the NAACP and helping to form SNCC and be an advisor to the young people in SNCC and kind of coining the phrase of grassroots leadership and grassroots leadership development. Well, it turns out in the 30s, when she was just out of college, she was a co-founder of the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And so she actually started her career in the co-op movement, right? And then became a civil rights activist later. So she was bringing all the nuance and innovation she brought to the civil rights movement came from her work in the co-op movement. So her understanding of grassroots democracy and all that was because of her co-op work. And she had traveled all over the country as executive director of the Young Negroes Cooperative League, doing education programs, helping people do all the innovative grassroots fundraising, things like that, and promoting it. But also at the very first conference in 1931 in Pittsburgh of the Young Negroes Cooperative League, she gave the closing speech. And what was the topic? The role of Black women in co-ops and how essential and important it was. And the Young Negroes Cooperative League, their mission was to bring young people and women on equal terms into the co-op movement and have them be the leaders of a new generation of people seeing economic development in a new way. So that's, you know, that's kind of epitomizes my view of what's happening with Black women in the co-op movement. And then you get women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who did the opposite. She starts out in the civil rights movement doing voting rights, and then realizes in the middle of all that she actually wants and needs to focus on cooperative economics, because what she said is they retaliate against us when we try to register to vote and when we try to organize politically. And if we don't own our own land, create our own food, have co-op housing, they can undermine us economically, and they can stop us, right? She was a sharecropper with her husband. They got thrown off the land that they'd been sharecropping for 15 years because they registered to vote. So she was like, we have to stop this, right? We need our economic independence. We need economic stability. We need to own our own stuff. We need collectives and cooperatives. And then we can fight for the political rights from a position of strength and economic independence. But otherwise, they're going to win if they control us economically. So that's another, right? A strong Black woman who really understood that connection, right? We really can't have any of the other justices if we don't get our economic justice, if we don't have our own economic self-determination. And so, you know, those examples, you know, are just so refreshing and so motivating, I think. Hopefully other people do too. But that also, you know, and then there's lots of lesser known Black women who were credited even by the Black men in the co-op movement for keeping a co-op together, launching it, keeping it going, running a women's guild, keeping motivations up, you know, being the treasurer, all those kinds of stuff. So many cases I kept finding where people were saying, if it wasn't for the women, or if it wasn't for the women's group, our co-op would never have gotten this far, or that kind of thing.
Awesome. So we're halfway through the conversation. So make sure if you're on YouTube or Facebook, get your questions. And I see some questions coming in, so we'll get to that in a second. So you talked about Fannie Lou and Ella Baker, which I don't think we were surprised as well, but we was very happy to see that. And a lot of us was talking about these are the two favorite people in the book. But they dabble in politics. They did the work, standing on economics and cooperatives. Food sovereignty was a thing.
Absolutely.
Do you think there is one particular area, if we are to do cooperative, that you would advise us to go into? Like, will it be food sovereignty? Will it be production of something? I mean, I know it's probably a interesting question, but is there an industry or something that you would advise us to go into Us as
You know,
African Americans.
I get versions of that question a lot, and I've got to say it's yes and no, right? If you look through history, I would say, agricultural and food co-ops are probably the most prevalent of the co-ops that Blacks started. And so in some ways, naturally, right, being able to produce food. In fact, some of the early, right, the kitchen gardens enslaved peoples were doing collectively, right, because that was how we survived, right? We had to be able to create our own food. And to do that, we needed some kind of control over land and hope. And often it was to own it, right, or to own it collectively, right? So in some ways, I would say, right, that the food sovereignty, the land ownership, right, are kind of the basis. And they're the most prevalent of what we did. But I don't think it's going to be enough, right? I really believe that we need cooperative ownership in all industries and all sectors, because it's also really the next most prevalent probably of the co-ops were the credit unions. The Blacks started and ran their own credit unions really early on. First, they were called credit exchanges in the 1880s. And then by the time we actually had credit union law, I think 1906 or something like that, we then started doing our own credit unions. But that access to credit, especially in a capitalist world, is really essential, right? Having democratic access to credit in places that knew who we were, treated us as human beings, and were owned and run by us were really important, because, as you know, most of the time we were not given loans by regular banks. Even the federal the federal banking system, the federal farmers, right, either gouged us with high interest rates or didn't give us loans. So we were, the only place we could really be non-exploited in the credit world was owning our own cooperative finance institutions, which are credit unions. So I would say, the credit industry is probably just as important as food. But I also think if we're really talking about transforming society and moving past capitalism, right, then we need to apply co-ops to everything we do. We need co-op housing, right? That's the best way to make affordable housing. We need community land trusts. We need worker co-ops, right? Every way that we produce and every way that we create services, right, should be owned together collectively in non-exploitative ways, so that all workers get back the return that they deserve for the work they put in, right? And we won't really be able to change the values and the way society operates if we don't change the nature of work, right? If we don't really democratize work and democratize the ownership of capital and the ownership of production. So I really can't and don't want to say there's only one. If we just do one industry, we'll be good. But I do think that it's probably true that we can build up to things, right? So there's some natural things that might happen first that we can embrace. And then after we do that, one of the visions of the Young Negroes Cooperative League, for example, was to do just that, to start small. Wherever you had 2 or 3 people come together and do a buying club or something, then they could find other people like them and do a store, and then do a credit union, then do a regional credit system, and then do regional co-op factories that feed into it, right? So building up, starting wherever the greatest need is, starting small, but then connecting and federating and working up and building up to taking over sort of all the systems in whatever order makes sense for that region. I think that's what we should be thinking about. But I don't think we should feel like we have to do it all at once, or we have to start big. I think we have to start small for it to really be authentic and to work well. And then, as we said, start where we are, start with what we need, and then keep building up. The more we learn how to do this together, the more we can see how it can be used in a different industry, in a different sector, and keep building it up.
So, did the cooperative movement over the decades have widespread support from traditional civil rights organizations, say the NAACP, CORE, different groups like that? Did they advocate or support the idea or the concept of worker cooperatives?
Not really. Definitely not widespread support. Again, what I found was, at first I thought they didn't give any support, but then I found out that they quietly did support in different ways. So like in the 60s, actually basically all the major civil rights organizations, the ones you named, did actually come together and have a meeting about economic condition, especially of Blacks in the South. And they realized there needed to be, that co-ops were a good solution, and there needed to be a regional organization. So they all helped to bring money, had a meeting, and helped to organize the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which still exists today, 54 years later, as a regional co-op development association. And they're also a land fund to help Blacks keep their land, and especially to keep it by doing cooperative farming, that kind of thing. So they did quietly, help to create the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And there were other times in history where some of the largest Black organizations were supportive of cooperative economics. But often, again, because of how oppressive this U.S. system is, right? If you even talk to people who were in some of those organizations in the 60s, they'll tell you that because of red baiting and the McCarthy era in the 50s, which was so anti-communism, right? Co-ops were considered communist and socialist and a bad word. And so most of the time, those organizations stayed away. They didn't publicly say they were supporting cooperatives. They didn't talk about it publicly because they didn't want to be red baited. They didn't want the government to come after them and blacklist them. They also didn't want debate in the Black community about it because, some people still were fighting and arguing for Black capitalism. Some people were more right. So they kind of underground did it. And a lot of other groups like that, the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, which was a co-op development organization, a union, a organized labor union, a political party, and a Black populist organization. It spent most of its time in the 1880s underground because, right, remember, that's the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacy and Jim Crow. And so the powers that be didn't want to hear Black people talking about removing themselves from the capitalist system and, having their own stores and their own credit unions and that kind of stuff. So they were under attack all the time. So they didn't really talk about it publicly. Most of their meetings were underground. You didn't know. Everybody whispered about when they were. And so I think that notion that we couldn't talk about, don't bring too much attention to the co-ops because of all the opposition, right? There's white supremacist terrorism that happens. There's political repression. There's economic retaliation. There's financial sabotage. So some Blacks didn't even name their co-ops co-op because they didn't want to bring attention to it and get all that retaliation and sabotage against them. So we also have this, I was going to say horrible, but maybe that's not the right word, a frustrating history of people doing it, but not really even telling their children about it, not really passing it on, not bragging about it because it was so dangerous, both politically and economically, and sometimes physically dangerous to be involved in it. So it's a real contradiction that we were still kind of practicing it, but not labeling it, not talking about it too much, and people didn't really realize or know too much about what was happening, even though we have this continuous history and legacy of people doing it. I don't know if that answered your question, but
it does. I would add. Let me do just a quick follow-up question. Now, I would suspect that because of the history of the Black church, cooperative economics would have been kind of baked in, if you will, into the development of Black churches. What did you find in your research about the contributions of the institutional Black church to the cooperative movement?
Right. So the other thing is the Black churches and even other Black religious organizations actually tended to be very supportive and play a role in the Black co-op movement. So a lot of the early, and it started out with mutual aid, right? A lot of the mutual aid societies came out of religious groups, were housed in churches and things like that. a lot of the early credit unions came out of churches. A lot of the early mutual insurance companies and banking came out that way. And so there was a lot of support from the Black church for co-ops. Again, sometimes it was very quiet because sometimes the Black churches were also afraid of being known or being labeled or whatever. But a lot of meetings happened in churches. A lot of people also, because they knew each other from church, right? They would start a co-op together, because often co-ops, right, you have to start with trust and knowing each other, right? So we have a lot of examples where people were in the same church and started a co-op, or that they actually started the co-op through or in the church. So there is those relationships. A lot of the values of co-ops and cooperation resonated to other religious values. The Nation of Islam, throughout its history in the U.S., has also supported worker co-ops as well as food co-ops and credit unions. So that's why I would say it's not just the Black church, but Black religious organizations, both formal and informal, seem to have resonated to this and have been helpful most of the time, right? And so there is an interesting connection between sort of the Black spiritualism and the co-op movement.
I want to ask this question about response to capitalism. Could you share why you believe, if you believe, that this concept of Black capitalism is not a good response, or it doesn't work, it's not feasible for us?
Right. So I have two, maybe it's three, probably three major objections to Black capitalism. The first one is capitalism is an extremely exploitative system, anti-human exploitative system. So I have a moral, right? I have a moral revulsion to it because I hate the way it exploits human beings. I hate the way it exploits Mother Nature, the environment, right? I don't believe that human beings should operate under a profit maximizing structure. I think we need a needs, to address need. We need to maximize how well we can address needs and create abundance for everybody. That's the kind of model I want. So the first thing is that, right, that moral objection to the whole purpose, mission, and structure of capitalism. I also think it's very clear that capitalism is what has created economic inequality, as well as I told you earlier, I think capitalism actually helped to create racism, right? I mean, they all kind of developed together, but so the legacies, right, of what capitalism had, I don't really believe that you can humanize or soften capitalism. Capitalism can't exist if you're not exploiting people, and the people who have more power run off with the spoils under capitalism. There's no way you can get around that. Now, some people think, okay, but if that's the reigning economic system, then shouldn't some of us get a piece of that pie? And that's sort of Black capitalism, right? Let some of us, right? And then the notion is, well, at least we hire more Black folks and maybe we're better employers, but we're still, a Black capitalist is still an exploiter, right? A Black capitalist still has to do profit maximization above everything else, which is not human. Right? Human is about addressing human needs and social reproduction so that we can become better human beings. But that's not what capitalism does. It actually creates worse human beings because of what it forces people to do in order to stay in the game, right? So I don't want other Black people to be capitalists. I don't want other Black people exploiting other people. And I don't want people thinking that's the end game, that that's the best we can do. I know we can do better. I know that we can, unalienate ourselves, right? And create systems that are much more human, that are much more about human development, and make sure that we all grow together, we all prosper together, and that nobody has to be exploited, or at least as little exploitation as possible. That's what I would rather do. I would rather not try to, emulate the worst of mainstream society. I would rather us show the world that we can be better and do better, and how to do that better.
So the role that W.E.B. Du Bois played in the cooperative movement is featured throughout the book. Could you speak with us for a moment about the role, the pivotal role that Du Bois played in popularizing and advocating for cooperative economics?
Right. So let me just correct one thing. I don't know that Du Bois had a pivotal role.
Okay.
He had a strong theoretical model that I used to base my book around because he had such beautiful words and theory. In terms of his actual mark on the co-op world, yes, important because he was one of the first to have a conference, right? So in 1907, he had a conference on Black co-ops and brought people together to talk about and document. He documented Black co-ops in a book that came out of that conference and in an earlier book on Black business development where he focused on cooperative economics. He tried to create a Black co-op organization in 1918, the Negro Business Guild, and held a meeting, but unfortunately that didn't go very far. And then he did write, from the 1890s to probably most of his life, but definitely at least up until his autobiography in 1940, he wrote beautifully about the theory of cooperatives and tried to support people to develop cooperatives. So I hesitated about pivotal because I would say the Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union in the 1880s with about 1 million members was probably more pivotal in terms of how many co-ops got built in that period of time and what they were doing. Maybe the Black Panther Party might have been pivotal. They were doing a lot of co-op stuff in the 60s. Even the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 30s and 40s was probably more pivotal than Du Bois in terms of actually getting people to do study groups and to start co-ops. But Du Bois did the intellectual leadership for any of us who were looking for his stuff. But the sad part is, even though he wrote so eloquently and beautifully about this notion of a group economy and that as cooperators, we could show the world a better way to live and that we could bring ourselves out, what he has, there's a quote about we can enter the new city as men and women, not mules, right? So beautiful, beautiful language, but most people don't even know, right? Most people, in terms of what we read in school, if you even read Du Bois, in terms of what the media talks about when they talk about Du Bois, they don't talk about any of that stuff, right? They talk about the Talented Tenth. They talk about how he fought with Garvey and fought with Booker T. Washington. Some people, give him credit for starting urban sociology, but who talks about his co-op stuff? That's the other reason why I kind of featured him a lot, not just because the words and the theory was so beautiful, but because all that stuff was lost to history, right? I hadn't even known it. And I had taken a course on Du Bois and studied him a lot. It was until one of my colleagues, Curtis Haynes, in grad school, had done his thesis on it, that he said, oh, read this stuff from Du Bois. And I was like, how did I miss this stuff? So sorry, I didn't mean to really quibble about the pivotal bit. So definitely intellectual leadership. He gave us a lot of ideas to think through, but he struggled. And he actually says in his 1940 autobiography, he wished he had persisted with talking about co-ops more than he did. But like by the First World War, he got distracted with World War stuff and Black socialism stuff. And then in the 30s, he was fighting with the NAACP because by then he had this articulation that we needed a separate group economy that was cooperative and that we need to do that first before anything else. And the NAACP said, oh, no, we don't believe in any kind of segregation. And in fact, he finally left the NAACP over this because they were like, no, you can't talk about Black co-ops and a separate Black co-op economy because we don't want to talk about segregation in any form. So, he definitely went through periods where he was struggling with how much to say and when. But remember, it's also a really repressive time. So Black leaders, it's hard for them to talk about this stuff and either get heard or respected. So I think there's, again, what should I call it? The contradictions and tensions, right, in the world and in history. He lived long enough to keep talking about it and to keep referring to it, but unfortunately, it wasn't one of the areas that he was able to make a huge inroad. People weren't really willing to listen to him about the co-op stuff.
Let's just hope that he was so quiet underground doing cooperatives that we haven't found it yet.
I mean, I was able to find some co-ops that people said, oh, I went to a meeting with Du Bois and then I went home and started a co-op. So there's some evidence of that. So it's clear some people were able to, at the time, listen to him and go act on it and do stuff.
I appreciate the correction. I would let me ask this really quickly. So often the narrative is that there's this bifurcation, if you will, this conflict between Du Bois and Garvey. Do you think that there was some type of overlap in their economic views when it comes to cooperative economics on this issue?
Yeah, there definitely was. I mean, Garvey wasn't totally about co-ops, but he was definitely about some kind of democratic governance of collectively owned things, right? And Garvey's important point was that we need to have economic control, right? We need to control our own economics. We need economics that connects Blacks in the US to Blacks in the Caribbean to Blacks in Africa, right? And then we need economic systems that help us to do that trade and whatever. And those things should be joint stock ownership, right? And some kind of democracy. So in that sense, they were very similar. They had a similar worldview about, right, Pan-African democratic economic ownership and control and self-determination. Unfortunately, they were very different personalities, came from different generations, right? So they didn't like each other's style, right? Garvey thought Du Bois was too elitist and puffy or whatever, and Du Bois thought Garvey was too populist and whatever. But I did find an interesting note after Garvey was deported and after his, the Black Star Line and the Negro factories were all dismantled because the government didn't want them to succeed, but also they weren't really managed that well, unfortunately. But Du Bois actually writes a letter to the Department of Commerce. I have this in the book. And he says, please return the people's pooled savings for all the joint stock that everybody bought, right? I forget how many Blacks bought $5 shares into one of those two businesses. He said, please return that money so that people could reinvest it into another joint program rather than be discouraged and feel like their efforts to pool resources and do something meaningful with it are destroyed. Of course, the Department of Commerce didn't do that. They didn't return any of the money and they didn't, right? But it was interesting that, Du Bois put aside any of his arguments with Garvey to actually try to support what Garvey had started and to try to keep it going.
So as we wrap up, there's actually a question from a Gullah comrade who's in Gullah country, Freetown, Sierra Leone. He happens to be a Garveyite. So, and we know Garvey, Garvey is rooted in Pan-African thought, and W.E.B. Du Bois as well, right? He did conferences, but he obviously didn't talk extensively about cooperatives at any of those conferences. But his question is, how do you see the cooperative system operating in the context of Pan-African economic development?
Right. So I think that cooperatives are and can be and should be a central aspect of Pan-African development. So even though I talk about starting small and starting local, right? I still believe that because I believe you've got to start small and local to get everybody into the practice of economic democracy, and that has to start small. But I believe in these federating, right? So all these interlocking, I believe in interlocking systems, interlocking supply chains, interlocking trade, right? So actually the Federation of Southern Cooperatives does do work with other Black co-ops in the Caribbean and in Africa. They do co-op training, they do co-op trade, et cetera. And I think we should build up, right? It's also a way, again, to go back to Fannie Lou Hamer's idea that we have to have economic self-sufficiency and economic independence before we can really fight for the rest of our rights. I think we need that not just in the US, but we need a Pan-African self-determination, economic self-sufficiency. And that would be through these interlocking co-op networks, interlocking co-op federations that are trading and working internationally. And the stronger we can get those linkages, the stronger that self-sufficiency between and among all of us, the Caribbean, Africa, all the African diaspora, I think the stronger economically we can be, so that then we can be strong politically.
Thank you. So as we wrap up again, if there's any final questions, make sure you throw those in the software. If you have any more questions, do so. And I don't think there's a lot of comments, but not a lot of questions in there. Thank you all. We've been that like a gang of people for a whole time, so they're here to listen to all the cooperative talk. Asafo, you have anything?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Great questions, great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So we got some people talking about the nuance and disagreements between Garvey and Du Bois. There was another question in here. Maybe it's this one.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, right, the world is always trying to get us Black folks to fight against each other and to fight for the crumbs, and we have to stop that mentality, right? We may have slightly different strategies, we may have disagreements on exactly how to do something, but I think we all want Black liberation, we all want prosperity, right? And so we need to figure out where we're together and where the common enemy is, and focus on that. Focus on building the new and better society, and not worry so much about the minor disagreements and the fights, which most of the time other people make them bigger than they really are.
So if we could just on that point, the comment, Geechee, that you just had up, just, if you don't mind, put that back up really quickly. It's interesting too how this country won't contemplate any other practice, and definitely won't let Black folks engage in other systems without sabotage, retribution, etc. This leads to the question: if you could, for a moment, elaborate on the methods that were used to undercut and sabotage cooperative movements and cooperative efforts.
Yes, I will, but I don't really want to end on that. So I'll do that, and then I'll try to end on how we overcame those things. So yeah, I talk about the whole gamut range of sabotage, from a simple sort of financial sabotage, right? A bank not lending money to a co-op, or not having helping a co-op to develop, or white competitors trying to undermine what the co-op is doing and undercut it, and that kind of thing, right? So very simple, direct sabotage. We move up the ladder of sabotage to things like landlords and insurance companies upping the rent, upping the premium, so that it's impossible to afford to stay where you are or to get coverage that you need. That's another kind of sabotage that we see lots of examples of, or even people not even selling you the land, or transportation, like railroads not transporting your stuff, right? So we have all those kind of levels of sabotage. And then we get worse. We get to the sabotage of undermining the leadership, right? Talking bad about the leadership, accusing the leaders of rape and this and that, so that you can try to lynch them. And so then there's all kinds of lynching to stop Black cooperators, burning down Black co-op stores. One co-op talked about how they poisoned their water, so they didn't have a water system, right? So there's all those kind of levels of terrorism, right, and white supremacist violence. And then I would say there's also the state violence, right? the examples of the federal government not giving loans so that you could buy land or keep your land, or federal government doing redlining and things like that, right? So that's state violence. There's also state violence, I think, the whole ideology making us feel like doing cooperatives, doing cooperative ownership and mutual aid, that there was something wrong and criminal about that, right? That we were traitors if we were trying to practice any kind of socialism, communism, or collectivism. That's a kind of sabotage also, and it made it so that we couldn't even sometimes imagine a different future because we were so scared, right, that it was the wrong thing, or that it didn't work, or that we would be put in jail for believing it, or something like that, right? So basically there's spiritual, ideological sabotage, and then there's all these physical kinds of sabotage, and then there's the actual terrorism. And so we suffered that throughout the 400, 500 years of being here on this soil. And yet, right, I could still write a book and talk about this whole continuous long history of people continuing to do this, even getting up, right, like Phoenix out of the ashes, right? Even when one co-op gets sabotaged, or you have to go underground, or it goes bad because a landlord, upped your rent and you couldn't keep it open, right? People just kept going back and creating new ones, learning new lessons, but also not just the resilience, but also the protection. What I also found was a lot of co-ops were able to survive because the communities protected them, whether they actually went out there with their guns and stuff in front of your co-op to protect it, or whether they gave you loans or became customers of the co-op so it would last longer, or helped with the transportation, right? So there's all kinds of examples where if and when the community understood what the co-op was about and what it was doing, the community protected and supported and helped to sustain the co-ops. So there's, just great, wonderful histories and stories about collective determination, collective action on the economic side to both start and support and persist with co-op movement.
Awesome. Dr. Jessica, is there anything coming up for you, lectures, books, or any projects that you're working on that you want to share?
I'm working on a graphic novel version of the book for a different audience. Hopefully next year it'll be out. I will be there is a Black Co-op conference. It was supposed to be in Baltimore, but now it'll be virtual. The end of this month, I'll be talking about the role of women at one of the workshops. And what else am I doing? There's actually a bunch of stuff on the web that's, I think, open to the public. I did an 11-part series on each chapter of my book for the Kepler Institute in Indianapolis that I believe is online, for people who want to go chapter by chapter. I have an article on the case against cooperatives, the case for sabotage against co-ops and the case for reparations. That's in the Journal of African American History in 2018, I think, where I talk about a lot of the sabotage, but then I argue that we should use reparations money to do more co-op education and co-op development, funding and development. So that's another thing people could look at. And I'm working now on research on studying worker co-ops among incarcerated people while they're still in prison, and how important that option is. Of course, everywhere else in the world has it. We don't have it in the US, but Puerto Rico had it before COVID. And I'm trying to study the different examples so I can explain the best practices and try to figure out how we could start doing that in the US. But how important it is, right, in sort of the worst, most marginalized, most dehumanized places on earth, right, in prison, that owning your own worker co-op in prison can make a difference and can help us think about different ways to abolish prisons.
It's a bummer that I'm going to miss you in Baltimore. I do a lot of work in Baltimore and on with co-op, so we have to do the virtual meet again. So it's cool. Anything you got, Asafo, before we go? Thank you all for watching, and the people who are rewatching, you can still engage with us by commenting, and people will definitely dialogue with you in the comment section. Anything else?
Well, I just want to express my appreciation to Dr. Nembhard for not only participating in the study group session with us, but also speaking with us here for our BABTalk show. Also appreciate our audience for the comments and questions, and for just viewing and sharing, liking and subscribing and what have you. So we're appreciative for that, and that's all I have to say.
All right, y'all. Y'all have a good night. Appreciate you all.
Thanks. Stay well.